religious world is that we don't know how to read poetry and we don't care, right? No, but I don't know. I know the religious world is much wider than the one that I live in, but in the one that I live in, which is really very Haredi in its orientation, there are 2 or 3 guys who are like mikubalim, right? They're the guys who show up at shul and the rabbi says, oh, you can't miss this. It's going to be matim. And he speaks sometimes, interestingly, for about, 40, whatever the time is, but for 3/4 of it. And in the last quarter, it's like going off into the stratosphere of mysticism, right? It always ends with, now I'm going to tell you something matim, which means you're not going to understand this. Don't ask me any questions. Meaning there's, I think, an avoidance of explanation in relationship to the poetic.
Is that like the male version of, oh, you can't understand this, Gemara is for men?
Yeah, that's yours is the gendered version, right? And this is you, and that's part of also the hierarchy of learning in the Jewish world. At this part of the Jewish world, there are these people who do it, but the rest of us don't do it, right? Whatever. I have a lot to say about that, but it's not so interesting. Or what we're doing today is of more interest. So we've been talking about about Samson through the lens of those 3 perspectives. The last talk was, we didn't bring it home, was called Rabbi Akiva and the Return of Laughter. And Rembrandt and the Return of Laughter. And in some sense, Rembrandt's paintings of Samson bring back, I think, a certain kind of laughter in relationship to the subject matter. We had wondered in looking at the Samson of the rabbis. One of the midrashim says, the verse says, Samson is going to take vengeance all at once for both of his eyes. And the Chazal darshan that and say, no, Samson said, I want revenge for one of my eyes in this world and one eye in the world to come. That even though, according to the rabbi, Samson is so immersed in the physical, when it says, V'yigdal Shimshon, and he was blessed, the rabbis say he was blessed with a large penis. They really say that. And Samson is understood through the rabbi's lens entirely through his desire. But still, at the end of the story, there's that one eye that's looking towards the future. Lasid labo, latid labo, to the world to come, to the future, to the possibility of a future, to providence, to regeneration, right? Which is really the theme of this afternoon on Tisha B'Av. I'll be rabbinic now, right? It is really the theme of the afternoon. Of there's a psalm, Mizmor LaAsaf, 79th Psalm, which is about the destruction of Beit HaMikdash. So the Meforshim ask, how can that be? Why would we say a Mizmor, which always means a kind of celebration about this devastating event in Jewish history? And the answers are all geared towards saying, I think Rashi says, they were grateful that God took out his wrath on the structure of the Beit HaMikdash and not on us. It's clearly like not the Pashtut, but Rashi's like reading between the lines in order to find something that's redeeming. And in one of the commentaries, the Malbim says that we still believe, we still, as the people of Israel, still believe in hashgacha v'hitchadshut, in renewal and providence. And I think that's the reading of the rabbi's reading of Samson, as well as that one eye still believes in that. One eye is not entirely immersed in the physical. And we wondered in that context whether there's somebody, and we were talking about laughter, whether, one more thing about Samson, at the end of the text, he says, I'll perform, but I'm not going to be happy about it. I'm not going to smile. I'm not going to laugh. Meaning the Plishtim are putting them in their game, in their story. It's the worst possible thing for Shimshon. He wants to be the star of the story in the story of God the Redeemer, and he's turning into the figure of the enemy in the Philistines, the victorious. So that for him is horrible. So he says, when they say to him, play for us, which is what they say, perform for us, perform in our theater. That's what the Pasuk calls it. He says, I'll do it, but I'm not going to laugh about it. I'm not happy about it. So that prompted us to ask in relationship to Samson, is there someone off stage who's maybe laughing, in which Samson is really the redeemer, as Jacob blesses him? Is he really a kind of redeemer? Jacob's blessing to Samson is tied up to redemption. we looked up at a midrash there, which is wild, that he looks at, he's of the Shevet of Dan, and Dan is associated with the Nachash. And at the end of the blessing, Jacob cries out, Kiviti, Hashem Kiviti, I wait for you, I'm hoping for you. And the Meforshim understand that Samson is associated with redemption. And then the next midrash says, well, Jacob realizes that Samson dies. He's not going to be the real redeemer. And then at that point, Jacob in this midrash says, Kiviti, Kiviti, Hashem Kiviti, I trust in you, God. I trust in you. That is, Samson is this ambivalent figure, and that's really the question of Tisha B'Av. It's the question of theodicy, which is what we've been talking about. Is the divine present in the world, right? That's the question, right? That's kind of hammering home why we're talking about this. We'll talk about Rabbi Akiva in a second. That when you look at Shimshon, is he doing this because he's just into this girl in that town called Timnah? And he says, oh yeah, God wants me to have her. And the parents say, oh, okay. Right? Is it just his desire? Or at the end of the story, which really is a riddle, is it because he's living out God's story? Is God present in the world, or is God not present in the world? And I think in Tisha B'Av, I think this is what we do on Tisha B'Av. We experience the day completely, at least the morning, completely disconnected from anything having to do with redemption. We live out that perspective of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow from Macbeth. That we are thrust into that time where there is no redemption, where there is no future, where Jacob does not say Kiviti Hashem Kiviti. Tisha B'Av not every day, right? But I think that's a good way of looking at the liturgical calendar as well, that the liturgical calendar is a way of us understanding experiencing different perspectives on what it means to be a Jewish person. And on Tisha B'Av, for that night and that morning, we experience that feeling of being unmoored, without a beginning, or with a beginning, but with that our story has now ended. There is no redeemer. The father has broken off his relationship to his child, right? The teacher has broken off the relationship to his student. That's the living out of abandonment. So that's why I really wanted to talk about Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva, how many of you guys know the story? Oh, hi, Tom. How are you? It's good to see you.
Yeah, I'm good. Which story?
So Will,
About paradise?
Tikva, you don't have to. I know you went to a very good Jewish day school, Tikva. You don't even have to answer that question, and that you're very well read. So the story is, and it's a story that you hear all the time in Shirim about Tisha B'Av. And the story is that him and Rabbi Akiva and some other sages, they see from a distance, they see the Temple Mount that's been burnt down. They get a little closer. They see a fox crawling out of its precincts. The rest of the rabbis and three others, they start weeping. Rabbi Akiva starts laughing. They say, why are you laughing? He says, why are you weeping? And then he gives a kind of drush about why it all works out well in the end. And I always really resented the story because it seemed to me so simplistic. So I wanted to go back to it and to see what the sages are actually doing with the story. Because I think, and here I'm starting with Thomas Mann, his midrash, and just for kind of definitions or a way to explain both my initial experience of the midrash on Rabbi Akiva and what I hope we'll develop today together. So here, in one of Mann's made-up midrashim, he makes up certain stuff. Joseph is in jail. He's talking to his jailer. It turns out his jailer is a kind of novelist, ho-ho, right? And they talk while Joseph is in jail. It really is so innovative. While he's in jail, they talk about their common interests, and one of the things happens to be literature. And he says this is his jailer, and Joseph, in the story that Mann tells, when he's freed, this jailer becomes Joseph's right-hand man. There is undeniably a certain poetry in the literalness of such speech, the poetry of simplicity and fairy tales. So here the jailer is talking about the kinds of stories that people tell to each other, they tell to their children. And he says there's a value to some kinds of stories like that. The poetry of simplicity and fairy tales. There are, as I see it, two kinds of poetry. one born of the simplicity of the masses, and one born of the spirit of the written word. The latter being the written word, by which I think man means commentary, the latter is indubitably the loftier. But in my opinion, it gets more interesting, but in my opinion, it cannot exist except in friendly association with the former, meaning the commentary requires the fairy tale and requires its fertile ground, just as all the beauty of a higher life, even the splendor of Pharaoh himself, needs the topsoil of a vast indigenous population in order to flower above it and set the world in amazement. If he's not one of the greatest writers ever, man, it's such a beautiful book, especially for Jews. Or people know the Midrash because you just see what he's doing. So for our purposes, really, I'm interested in this distinction that he's making between fairy tale and commentary. For Man, the fairy tale of Joseph and his brothers, this is the heresy alert part. For Man, the fairy tale is the story in the Bible. That's the fairy tale. And the 1,500-page novel is the commentary, the written word. But what he says, of course, is that you can't have the latter, the commentary. It might be a little confusing for us because we think, or we associate commentary with Torah Shabbal Peh. But here, I think for Man, writing has to do with the commentary that renders the fairy tale something other, something different. The commentary really is Midrash. The commentary really is Joseph and his brothers. So when I'm reading Rabbi Akiva, getting back to what we were talking about, the story that I told you, that's the fairy tale. And I wanted to, and I'm grateful you're here because I want to work this through with you. I'm hoping we'll be able to work this through together and see some of the complexities here. Should we try it? Yeah? Do you see you have a Word document in front of you? Am I sharing a Word document?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you are. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's the Hebrew here. This is from Sepharia, which is basically excellent, but sometimes their English translations are very, very bad. So I'm going to read it from this art scroll thing, and I'm going to leave the Hebrew in front, okay? And we're going to read it slowly. The story is much more complicated, even in its basics, than I mentioned to you, because there's not only one story, there are really two stories as one story. And the pasuk that's being described here in this midrash is for Mount Zion, which lies desolate, foxes prowled over it. That's a pasuk from Lamentations, from Eicha, that the Mount Zion, which was once the place of the Holy of Holies, now has foxes prowling over it. Here's the story. And it happened once that Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Akiva were entering Rome. So this is not at all about Jerusalem, this is about Rome. And they heard the sound of the Roman masses from a distance of 120 mil, a long way away. What this actually means is not clear. Did they hear the voice coming out of the great city of Rome? Did they hear the sound of the suburbs around Rome, the commerce, the people? There's lots of discussion about this. So the rabbis, upon seeing this is from Eicha Rabbah, and it's Parsha 5, it's 5:18. They started weeping, but Rabbi Akiva was smiling. It's also, there are different versions. One is in Makot, which says not misachek, as it does here, but mitzachek, those two words which are very close to each other, one laughing, one playing. And they said to him, Akiva, we are weeping and you are smiling? Rabbi Akiva replied to them, and why did you weep? Lama bechitem? It's an interesting question because it's not why are you weeping, why did you weep? Meaning there's something about the interaction here that makes Rabbi Akiva or makes the other rabbis stop. Right? Why did you weep? We'll see there's a difference in the second story. That's why I mentioned this here. By the way, guys, I'm please interrupt me, okay? If I'm not making sense or if there's more that you want to, if there's something that I'm not saying or that's not clear. Or if you want to add something, okay? They answered him. Should we not weep over the fact that the non-Jews perform idolatry and bow down to their idols and live in security, calm, and tranquility? And in contrast, the temple that is the footstool of God, what is the footstool of God? Ragli Elokeinu, that is the footstool of our God, has been consumed by fire and has become a dwelling place for the beasts of the field. And should we not weep? Rabbi Akiva responds to them, for this very reason I am smiling. For if such occurs to those who anger him, then certainly it will occur to those who perform his will. Writes it, and it's a kol v'chomer, im kain l'machisav kol v'chomer l'oisei ritzono. If the people who anger him, if they get that, what was their reward? They don't not only have wealth, but they have security, calm, and tranquility. Well, what about us? We don't have that. So what, can somebody help me just understand what this back and forth is here? Or let's ask the question better. How does Rabbi Akiva, well, if he does, it's also not clear from the story whether he cheers them up or not. We just move on right to the next story. We'll see if there's an implication that maybe he doesn't cheer them up. But how does he try to cheer them up? They say, let's just put it, let's try to understand that conversational vernacular. They say, we live in the time, there was a first temple, there was a second temple, and they both got destroyed. Things suck. And look at our enemies triumphing. So Rabbi Akiva answers, oh, well, if those who don't perform God's will, if they're rewarded in this way, think about what our reward will be.
I love how they kind of remove all responsibility for the destruction of the Mikdash. Like, they're like, oh, you know, our temple is destroyed. It has nothing to do with us and what we've done.
Where did they say? What were you? Okay, I mean, there is, I mean, sure, and okay, and maybe we'll come back. I mean, I'd like to come back to that issue of responsibility. I don't necessarily see how they're shirking that here, but let's keep that on the table. How is he trying to cheer them up? What's the argument here?
The argument.
Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay. Yeah.
Well, it seems that the argument is one of the future. You know, Rabbi Akiva is saying your tears are really an expression of a lack of emunah to a certain extent, because you're not able to see that this is just part of the process. This is part of the process, and
Okay.
and I can see what's to come. I can see this is just part of the process, and we're on our way to something so much better. That's what it seems to me. That
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, any kind of depression or sadness is very, very often characterized by the inability to be able to see beyond the here and now,
to not see an idea of futurity, really. And I think that's what the experience of Tisha B'Av is this lack of experience of the future. Did anybody want to respond to what Lindsay said?
Yeah, I think Rabbi Akiva's point takes on a present sense with the issue of agency, right? Because like piggybacking on Tikva a bit, the other guys sound like they have that victim mindset, or we could read this in. And then Akiva's giving a certain argument for agency, right?
That's
There's still reward to be gained, and though that's in the future, the present agency is here and now. It's
I was thinking, when you said what you were saying, I was thinking a little bit that you were reading the first story through the lens of the second story, and I think Tom is bringing back a little bit. I mean, I think the emphasis on the future is essential to understanding both of these stories. But I think here, the emphasis is on the present. And it's also, maybe, Lizzie, I will come back to what you said when we read the second story. But I see the argument that Akiva makes tied to what Tom says. It's also like a rational argument, like, cheer up, guys. If God, I don't really see the reference to the future. If God rewards these people this way, well, we do God's will. I guess you're saying his will is not being performed now, obviously, we're without a temple. One day, God's will be performed. I hear what you're saying. So there is the future built into that. But also nice what Tom says about this idea of Ose Ritzono. We are still in the position as agents, right? Which is very interesting at this point, that we're still even now agents, because you might think, and for Milton is here, Lindsay, Adam, after he falls in Paradise Lost, and Samson, over and over again, all they want to do, they both want to commit suicide all the time. They keep on saying, let's die, let's die, let's die. Because what you said earlier, without the idea of a future, there is no possible, you use nothing. There's absence. Sorry, I'm just getting family things. So why was I mentioning this kind of death drive that you see in Samson and in Milton's Adam? Is, yeah, without a future, and Rabbi Akiva is reminding them of the future, there really is no hope for agency. That agency is presupposed on that future, right? I'm working towards something, I think. Okay, so that's the first story, and we'll come back to it. Any other comments before we go to the second one? Okay, let's do this. This second one is just like, yeah.
I can't help thinking also that, when you get upset about how Hashem seems to reward the goyim, you're presuming to know how Hashem rewards. How do you know how Hashem
Yeah,
rewards?
I don't know. Fine, but and then that's what it says in the Haftorah today, which is, you should not miss that. It's incredibly beautiful. Your ways are not my ways. My ways are not your ways, right? It's like Hamlet might be paraphrasing from that. There's more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy. It's the Haftorah that we say on all fast days, but it is the most beautiful and feeling of redemption that you get from it. Like, the rabbis can't stay away from it's like all of the rabbinic literature is immersed in like total depression, but they can't stay away from optimism either. Meaning there's always that implicit optimism there, which is why the Jews have survived, right? We get it. Okay, here's the next story. Another time, the same four sages were going up to Yerushalayim. Higiu Sophie, B'karu Begodim, Bigdehem. So they reached Tzofim. Where do they get to? Are Tzofim in Jerusalem, and they rent their clothes. It's an interesting and important halachic detail. All four of them rent their clothes. Why do they rent their clothes? Because upon seeing Jerusalem, you see Jerusalem in ruins, you have to share in the mourning, which is an important detail to emphasize, especially in the context of what's coming, in which Rabbi Akiva once again laughs. That even though he laughs, there still is that legal matrix in which he functions, in which he recognizes mourning. So that there's going to be a certain kind of doubling of understanding here. Meaning whatever joy or whatever that laughter means, it's still qualified and preceded by this feeling of mourning. They reached the Temple Mount. Can you hear my daughter-in-law playing with her daughter in the background a little bit? No? Good. They reached the Temple Mount and saw a lone fox emerging from the former site of the Holy of Holies. They started weeping, but Rabbi Akiva smiled. They said to him, Akiva, you always astonish us. You always bring us matmiha. You always aleinu. You always bring us to the point of questioning, of not understanding. Once again, anu bochim va'atam misachek. Here they're still crying. Once again, we are weeping and you are smiling. Rabbi Akiva replied to them, and why are you weeping? Oh, sorry, I was going to back up here. why are you weeping? They said to him, why shouldn't we weep, right? This place about which is written, and the non-Kohen who approaches shall die. So there's a pasuk in the Midbar, in Numbers, a verse in Numbers that says, V'hazar hakarev yumat. And the stranger who comes, who approaches to give a sacrifice, I assume, he shall die. And behold, a fox emerges from it. And then they continue. And on that place was fulfilled the verse, for Mount Zion, which lies desolate, foxes prowled over it. The rabbis get involved in this kind of like hermeneutic dueling, meaning they do that all the time, this interpretive back and forth. So really, the rabbis here and elsewhere are involved in, or always thematizing the question of, well, how do you read? And there are two questions here. One question is, how do I read what's in front of me? There's a fox there. And then there's, how do I read the pasuk in Lamentations, right? The pasuk in Lamentations says there's a fox that's going to prowl over the Temple Mount. And according, so how do they read it? Why are they crying?
Because they see this extremely holy place being desecrated.
Mm-hmm.
So they, and what is the function of the verse from Numbers? Meaning the verse, in Numbers it says, no, but not even a stranger shouldn't be approached. And ad kama v'kama, it's how bad it is that there's an animal crawling over it, right? Something like that. And so according to them, the prophecy that existed in Lamentations is fulfilled in that moment. And what does the fulfillment of that mean?
That other prophecies will be fulfilled in the future.
Well, you're like, you took a
I'm
Rabbi.
sorry, I'm going into the future again.
You took a Rabbi Akiva cheerful pill, right? I mean, that's Rabbi. That's, by the way, Rabbi Akiva, and the reason people don't understand Midrash is because they think the criteria for understanding Midrash is accuracy. Like, and even the people who will say that Midrash is not literal, which of course it is not, they still have this idea of accuracy in their head that, oh, this is what really happened to Rabbi Akiva. And my feeling is, I almost said my position, my feeling is, it doesn't matter if it did happen, if it didn't happen. It is a story about Rabbi Akiva. It is a representation of Rabbi Akiva. Really, the question is, this story is being told by other rabbis, and then it is being edited into the Talmud by still other rabbis, that it is functioning as a narrative in the Talmud in general. And it has to be understood in those terms. The Midrash is like a poem. As soon as you start to read it like, oh, is this really Rabbi Akiva? Or like, what did Rabbi Akiva really think? Forget it. You're no longer reading it properly. Because it is, as the thing that I say most to my beginning literature class, it's a representation, right? When Homer writes about the Trojan War, and he writes about the glorification of death and honor, it's a representation. He is not necessarily glorifying death and honor. He's writing about it. He's representing it, right? He's allowing us to see it. And from that point, we read him and see how he represented it. So we do the same thing here in relationship to Rabbi Akiva. How is this figure who is present in the Talmud Bavli and the Jerusalem Talmud? I understand also that the representation of the Jerusalem Talmud and the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, are a little bit different. So anyway, he's playing a certain function here, a certain kind of role here. So and yeah, I don't want the cheerfulness yet, Lindsay. What is? They're crying, right? They're not crying because they see a future. Yes, Tekla?
I think one way to look at it is that Eicha is not a book of prophecy. It's a book of mourning and this description of destruction with very small sparkles of hope, because like you said, we just can't get rid of it. And the parak that pasuk is from describes the reality of the people who are left in Israel after the destruction of the temple. And it could be that they are crying because this terrible reality that happened, that existed right after the destruction of the first temple, is still there.
I think it's even worse. I mean, so Tikva, you've done this before with us. You're kind of refocusing us on the moment of that experience of desolation. I would say it's double, though. It's not only like, so Tikva's saying, according to the sages, there was mourning even in the second temple when it was built for the first temple, because there wasn't the glory of the first temple, of whatever that meant about the divine presence. I would think the Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues, his cohorts, are you saying, and Lindsay also mentioned this earlier, I think it's very, very useful to look at this through the lens of the existential and the personal. They are feeling a sense of absolute desolation, right? And I think humanizing the rabbis and saying they feel, I think in a way you can say they feel that their rule book, the Torah, it's almost like not even relevant anymore. I think that's the function of the first pasuk. Like our book tells us, our holy book tells us that even a zar is not even to come here. Now animals are crawling over it. Like what's left for us? So they feel that desolation. They feel that ending. I mean, I think we've been talking a lot about theodicy, justifying the ways of God to man, and that is the question of theodicy. Is there still hope in the face of trauma? And I think, Tikva, you are 100% right to let us feel that trauma. And as soon as you feel that trauma, then you move a little bit out of the fairy tale mode as well. And that's why, Lindsay, I don't want to go to the happy place yet, because the story emphasizes the extent of the trauma, the catastrophic extent of the trauma. And I think that's why Paradise Lost, why we love it so much, is because the formulation we developed together in this seminar in class was that Milton's Theodicy, Paradise Lost succeeds because it is a failure. Because a theodicy that succeeds fails because its answers are too pat, right? A theodicy that gives good answers sucks, right? A theodicy that does not give a space for grief, for anguish, for desolation is not a good theodicy because it doesn't relate to the human. So I do want to feel that here, okay? But I think that's good to locate us back. So they say that the prophecy of Jeremiah, which I always get mixed up on the chronology here because I did not go to Jewish day school. Jeremiah prophecies about which of the destructions?
He's first. There's no prophecies about the destruction of the second.
Right. There's okay. I just want to keep as you.
I'm stopping
You know that sometimes you confuse me, so let's just stop there. Okay. So that's where Yirmiyahu is. He's the first guy. Okay. So now Rabbi Akiva shows up.
He's the guy who does. He's the doom and despair guy specifically.
Okay. So now Rabbi Akiva shows up, and he says, in a display of great hermeneutic virtuosity. I said that for your benefit, Lindsay, just to make you feel like you're back in graduate school. In great hermeneutic virtuosity, he looks at it from a different perspective. So Rabbi Akiva said, I too, af ani lekach ani misachek. Oh, sorry, af ani, he says, af ani lekach ani misachek. I also had these thoughts, whatever that means. What the also means, I thought the same thing that you did. Really? And that is the very reason I am smiling. For behold, and here's the hermeneutic virtuosity. For behold, and we have to go slow here, but just to get the chronology and the speakers proper. For behold, Scripture states, I appointed trustworthy witnesses for myself. Uriah the Kohen and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah. Okay, so who is this? Who is the speaker here, who Akiva is citing? For behold, I appointed trustworthy witnesses for myself. So that is a pasuk in Isaiah. Okay? That is, yes, that is what it is. Rabbi Akiva said, see, how many times you learn the story, right? Okay, I too had these thoughts, and for this reason I am smiling. For behold, scripture states, I appointed trustworthy witnesses for myself. Uriah Kohen and Zechariah ben whatever his name is. And this is from Isaiah 8:2. Okay, that's the pasuk in Isaiah. When does Isaiah live?
He's, I think, a
Before
bit
the
before
destruction.
Jeremiah.
He's the good time
Yeah,
guy,
he's
right? I mean, when you look for
there.
the description of,
There.
in Rabbi Soloveitchik, he talks about two kinds of revelation. One is the revelation of plenitude, and one is the revelation of existential terror and isolation. The revelation of the latter, that's Yechezkel, Ezekiel, right? This sense of God revealing himself at a time of torment. For Soloveitchik, the Isaiah, he is the figure who reveals or writes about God's revelation through plenitude, Shefa, right? Isaiah lives in the good times. Of course, he refers to times that aren't so good, but it is a time of abundance. And that's before Jeremiah. So he's coming beforehand, okay? And there are two people here. And then I think Rabbi Akiva or they ask him, V'chima inyan Uriah etzel Zechariah. Now, what's the relationship of Uriah to Zechariah? Uriah was active during the era of the first temple, and Zechariah was active during the era of the second temple. This is where I got really confused. So much so that I gave a shir on this in London from my desk. Was one of those Zoom shirim. And I did not realize what we're doing right now, meaning I read this story not as the fairy tale and got it not wrong, but I ignored just a lot of it. So what is Rabbi Akiva coming to do? He's saying, well, there are two Eidim. They're Eidim Namani. One, and what is one's name? One is Uriah and one is Zechariah. Now, there are different perspectives in the Rishonim on to whom Rabbi Akiva is referring, or to who, this is where it gets tricky, to whom Rabbi Akiva says Isaiah is referring. That is, Rabbi Akiva is saying Isaiah prophesied about his two Eidim Namani. And one of them is Uriah, who most people say is referred to in Jeremiah. And the second is Zechariah, who is a prophet in the Second Temple period. He's actually a prophet at the time that Darius is allowing the Jewish people to rebuild the Second Temple. Okay? You got the chronology? Let's do it one more time since it was confusing for me, okay? Rabbi Akiva is writing himself after the destruction of the Second Temple. He goes back, and this is how he's going to cheer up the rabbis. He's quoting a pasuk in Isaiah. Isaiah doesn't specify who he's talking about. He can't specify who he's talking about because it hasn't happened yet, right? So Rabbi Akiva, this is the hermeneutic of virtuosity, retroactively says, I'll tell you who Isaiah was talking about. One of the prophets was Jeremiah, Uriah in Jeremiah. The other, who is prophesizing the destruction of the first temple. The other is Zechariah, who is prophesizing the building of the second temple, but he's got all sorts of doubts. In Zechariah, and this is like almost like something from a Monty Python routine, the people come to Jerusalem and they want to know from Babel. They come from Babylonia and they say, well, should we fast? Meaning you're rebuilding the temple. It's not rebuilt yet. And we want to know, should we fast or not? And they're clearly talking about avoiding responsibility, Tom. They're heading back to Babel. They're heading back to Babylonia. They're not going to help in the rebuilding of the temple. All they want to know is whether they can have bagels on Tisha B'Av, right? Before the end of the fast, right? So Zechariah is, at the same time that he prophesizes the future, it's still a little bit ambivalent what exactly he's prophesizing. Well, we'll see. We'll see. But anyway, so we have it straight. Rabbi Akiva says, oh, those are the two people. One is Jeremiah. He prophesied destruction. The other of the first temple, the other is Zechariah, prophesizing the rebuilding of the second temple. So the Rabbi Akiva either asks himself or they ask him. Now, what is the relation of the subject? Well, what?
Can you keep it down a little bit?
No. We can always mute you. Now, what is the relation of the subject of Uriah to Zechariah? And he asks what was implicit in my description. Uriah was active during the first temple in the story in Jeremiah, and Zechariah was active during the era of the second temple. Okay. And then he says, Elamah, rather the explanation of this verse is as follows. What prophecy did Uriah say? Thus said Hashem, master of legions, Zion will be plowed over like a field, Jerusalem will become ruins, and the Temple Mount will become like heaps of rubble in the forest. That's from Jeremiah. Uriah, a character in Jeremiah. So Uriah prophesizes death and destruction, the plowing over of Zion, Jerusalem and in ruins. And what prophecy did Zechariah say? And his is, old men and old women will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with his staff in his hand because of advanced age. They're so old, and yet they're dancing in the street. It's nice that it's the pasuk says,
And they're safe.
Misachkim v'rechovoteha, and they're dancing, they're smiling in the street.
That's about kids.
What?
That's about kids. The children are playing. Old men and women are sitting with their walking sticks, and then there are children playing in the streets.
Beautiful, right? So that's, and the streets. All right. So there are two psukim, 8:4 and 8:5, and the streets of the city will be filled with boys and girls playing in its streets. So it's either two things, that the boys and girls are also playing in the streets, or the pasuk that follows, filled with boys and girls playing in the streets, goes upon the old men and old women who are so old that they're dancing with their staffs, as if they're somehow dancing with childlike jubilation. Right? So there are two witnesses. And then it continues. Thus, this is Akiva, the Holy One, blessed be he, stated, behold, I have these two witnesses, Uriah and Zechariah, and if the words of Uriah will be fulfilled, then ultimately the words of Zechariah will be fulfilled. But if the words of Uriah will be nullified and the words of Zechariah will be nullified, then the words of Zechariah will be nullified. I rejoiced because I realized that the words of Uriah have been fulfilled, and so ultimately the words of Zechariah are destined to be fulfilled. And then the story ends, and with the phraseology, Rabbi Akiva responded to him, Akiva, you have comforted us in Makot, it says it twice. Akiva, you have comforted us. And the Meforshim, the commentators on Makot, the other place where the story appears, say that the rabbis say this to him once for consoling them for this story, and once for them consoling them for the story previous. Remember before, they don't respond, so the commentators or the text in Makot says that they feel this double consolation. So can we take like a 2-minute break, and then we'll come back and try to figure all this out? If you need to leave, you're tired, you have other things to do, I'm not going to be insulted. I'm grateful for your being here. So just let's take like a 2 or 3 minute break, okay?
All right.
Sure, I'll show you something else. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So I guess maybe we'll wait for Lindsay to come back. Or okay. Hi everybody. So I guess what I'm asking is what is the meaning of Rabbi Akiva's laughter? I guess I'm trying to understand the story from the perspective of the three rabbis, meaning to understand their sense of desolation and also the relationship to the prophecies that came before them. Rabbi Akiva himself acknowledges that these prophets don't have anything to do with one another. In what ways are they different? One is prophesizing good things. The other is prophesizing bad things. One is from the first temple. The other is from the second temple. So Lindsay, do you want to go with it? Go with your reading. So what's your reading? I mean, it follows, you were reading back from this story into the first story. So what's the reading then?
I don't know, quite simply that if the first prophecy came true, then the
Right.
second one is going to come true. But I'm also thinking now that the first Chorban had nothing to do or had much less to do with what was mentioned earlier. Both Rivka and Tom mentioned the idea of agency, and it was the second Chorban that had so much more to do with Yisrael and their misdemeanors. So which gives me reason to think that perhaps was even more of an enhancement, created more of an enhancement of Rabbi Akiva's joy. That not only do I have a sense that the second prophecy will come true. Now I believe it will. Now I know it will, and I know it will because it so much depends on us.
Do you have like a Hasidic background?
I do a little bit.
I mean,
In recent years, yeah. In fact, when you were talking about stories before and fairy tales and the fairy tales for the masses and Midrash, I couldn't help thinking of Rabbi Nachman.
Right.
Yeah, I'm very...
Levinas was a Litvak, but yeah, so that's a very cheerful version of the story.
Very optimistic.
Yeah, so if I'm, let's assume, it's like, let's assume that Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Lezer, and Rabbi Yeshua, they had to be Litvaks, right? Just like the Hasidim say, when Mashiach comes, it's obviously going to be a Chassid, right? So you go back to these rabbis, and it's got to be, they have to be Litvaks. So but I mean is, they look at Rabbi Yeshua, they say, you're crazy. I mean, I just want to recover that aspect of it, to recover that aspect of what are you talking about? We're sitting here in the ruins of the Second Temple. I'll even go further, right? The first guy said bad things were going to happen. It happened. Right? It happened. Good. The second guy came and prophesied about the coming together of the Second Temple. And that happened also. But guess what? It was destroyed. What about that? What now? What now? That's a good question, isn't it? And the second half of Zechariah, Tom, you'll be interested in this, is like people don't know how to read it because it's like apocalyptic in its nature. It's very messianic in its nature, which so you could read it, so you could read it backwards and just say when this prophecy that Zechariah is giving is being given not only for what's about to happen in the rebuilding of the Second Temple, but maybe some future messianic age as well. Maybe. Or I saw a commentary which goes like this. Why was Rabbi, this is like really like, this is like really a Litvish version of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, oh, so you see that the bad prophecy, that came true twice, right? When Jeremiah prophesied, it came through once and it came through twice. So you see also the Zechariah's prophecy, it came true once, it'll come true a second time as well. It's very like, I don't know. I mean, I think in a way that's shot, but
I like.
Yeah, it's very. It's something. It's too for me. It's like too clean,
too neat.
Although it does make logical sense, but it is very, very clean, right? So I'm just, and I'm wondering again. I'm writing about reading, right? My book is on not only poetry; it's on reading. So this really is an argument between Rabbi Akiva and the three rabbis. Well, they're not arguing about psukim. They each bring different psukim, but they're arguing about what lens do we look at this empirical reality through? How do we see what's in front of us? The rabbis say we see what's in front of us by seeing the fulfillment of a really bad prophecy. Things are bad. And Rabbi Akiva says, one thing we haven't touched on, which I think is really interesting, and that's just to go back to that hermeneutic virtuosity, that Rabbi Akiva is Isaiah's ventriloquist, right? He's telling you, I'll tell you what Isaiah said, right? We have no reason to think that's what Isaiah is talking about. Why would Isaiah bring two prophets that are talking about two different things, and one talking about one talking about a happy future and one talking about a sad future? Edim namanim is also a term that's used in halachic literature, right? They are good edim. They are reliable witnesses. And we usually think of reliable witnesses, they are providing edut on the same thing. That I think is real. I think that's the real, like, interpretive virtuosity, or as they say in the yeshiva world, the real chiddush. That's the real chiddush. that the two things are that, and the Eitz Yosef, who is the commentary, whatever, he's a very helpful commentary. He calls it he says that it is edut echat. It is one edut. And I think so that I think that so you're nodding, Lindsay. What do you understand when you hear that? That it's edut echad. I'm just asking you for your help here. It's very abstract in a way. Yeah, go ahead.
The desolation, that desecration and redemption are inextricably entwined.
It's all part of one story.
Yeah, sure. Which I think is also the Hasidic story.
Yeah.
Very much the Hasidic story.
Oh yeah.
En aliyah lelo nefila, lelo yerida. You know.
It's also, if you think of Freud's, if you think of Chassidut first, I think of that second, but I think of Freud's essay called the antithetical meaning of primal words, right? That one thing doesn't come into the world without its opposite, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Very similar. Right?
It's kind of
things right. So the Hasidic, I'm sorry, I'm not saying that to you. But in the Hasidic version is the darker it gets, the more light it is, right? So the best Hasidic Torah is on Purim and Hanukkah, because those are the darkest times, right? So they go into like high gear in Hanukkah and Purim, I think. But enough about me.
And whenever tragedy happens.
You're more of an expert on that than I am.
No, I wouldn't say that.
Right.
But.
So they're edut. So it's edut echad. It's one story.
May I backtrack a moment?
Sure.
When you were talking about the two, how the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva seem to be seeing things from two different lenses. One of the things that it reminds me of is that Rabbi Akiva comes into Torah very, very late in his life. Like he starts
40,
learning the Hebrew alphabet at the age of 40. And so he has this extremely fresh perspective as opposed to the rest of the rabbis. And I know that this is true for me in my Torah learning, that I love discussing these things with, my fellow Christian students or Muslim students, because they have this fresh perspective that I will never be able to achieve because I've been learning this my whole life.
That's very cool, right? See, Rabbi Akiva has the perpetual enthusiasm of the Bal Tshuva, and he doesn't Chozer B'Tshuva, and he doesn't become a fundamentalist, right? Which is always a possibility for the Chozer B'Tshuva, right, to become a fundamentalist. Right. Okay, I have a couple more questions. Two more questions. One is, why are they consoled for the first story from the story? We're not finished with the question we were asking. Why are they consoled from the first story? Why are they consoled about the first story from the second story? And then you raised a Tom, and I was thinking about it independently. What about Osei Ritzono? I mean, I think the implicit question is, it's not asked, but isn't the implicit question like, what do we do now? Right? What do we do now? How do we look at the present? How do we look at the present? I'll give you my simple answer to the first question, then we'll come back to this question, which I think is a much more significant question. The first question is, I think, as Tikva said, very located in a specific time. Or we feel their anguish, although there is that gesture to the future, oh, well, it'll be much better for Osei Ritzono, or Ad Kama V'Kama. It's still kind of like a logical syllogism, and I guess what happens in the second story is Rabbi Akiva makes articulate what Lindsay kind of assumed in the first story, that it's not just a question of, oh, the Romans now are thriving, one day we will. It's put in that prophetic framework in which they can then understand maybe the temporality of Rome. Not only just, well, we'll one day thrive like they are, but this is just a part of the story. Joseph, when he talks about, we'll come to him in a second, we'll end with him. Joseph, when he talks about Pharaoh, he says, oh, the dear pitiable Pharaoh, that the greatest figure in all of world history from the perspective of Joseph's story, which is God's story, he's just playing this minor role, right? But he doesn't, and I think a short answer to why they're consoled from the first story, for the first story by the second one is they see that as part of God's story. That's what Rabbi Akiva invokes. He invokes God's story. So then the question is, if we know God's story, well, I mean, so what now? What do they do now? I think that's the story that never gets asked in the fairy tale version. The fairy tale version is, oh, it's going to work out in the end, right? And you're emphasizing, and I think that's so important about the Odyssey, you're emphasizing with Tom's comment, Ose Ritzono, well, what now? Right? What do we do now? Tikva's comment also earlier. What about responsibility? What now? What do we do? How do we read the present? I think that is the question of theodicy. In the Greeks, the thought theodicy is always, how do we read the past? Oh, Odysseus came home, now I understand. Oh, Athens was founded, now I understand, right? But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's always an unknown future. It's always a as Harold Bloom says, a fulfilled covenant, an already fulfilled covenant, a remembered future. Meaning, when you think in those providential terms, it's not like the Greeks, oh, Odysseus is home. It's like, oh, yeah, something will happen in the future. We know that will happen. And we have experience because God he had one covenant with us. He took us out of Egypt, right? We'll fulfill there's evidence for one, there'll be evidence for there certainly will be another, whatever, however you want to put it. As I said to you, Bloom puts this in his introduction to the Iliad, that's one thing that distinguishes Greek epic from the Christian, is that there is no remembered future in the Greeks. There is no covenant fulfilled in the Greeks. The only time the covenant is fulfilled is when it's actually fulfilled, when Odysseus gets home. There's no waiting, right? And it's also, of course, the Greeks, it's very local. Odysseus' household, Athens is a city. And for Christians and Jews, whatever, it's particular, it's universalist in its emphasis.
Could it be argued that in the Greek mythos, the Greek mythos does not connect between the myth and the present, whereas there's no causation that connects the myth to the present.
Or it doesn't put us, I think, in the situation of the story at the end, which is, well, what now? I mean, our question at the end of the Odyssey is, what is Odysseus going to do now, right? Not as you point out, what do we do now? It's very interesting what you're saying. It's interesting. Aristotle's view of tragedy is it makes you kind of freak out. And it's effective. It blows you away. We talked about last time how we said, Lindsay, that the chorus at the end of Samson, who were like, oh, everything is great here, now we have calm of mind, that's just an illusion of the chorus. They're playing out their role as Greeks. Oh yeah, we were blown away by that. Now everything is clarified. But anyway, here,
Interesting.
Ose Ritzono, right? Great. That's such a great insight, Tom, right? What do we do now? How do we read the present now?
Well, isn't it also, I don't remember, are these, Rabbi Akiva and his friends, are they post Korban or like right at the time of the Korban?
No, they're post Korban. They see it's in ruin. It's in ruins. It's in ruins. Absolute ruins.
About a generation later, 50 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Right, it's hard to get the temporality. It's very confusing. And I'm just saying, in most recountings of the story, Rabbi Akiva's creativity is completely erased. You don't see what he's doing. You think, oh, you think that Isaiah must be referring to prophets that already happened. But no, he's referring to prophecies that haven't happened, that Rabbi Akiva is identifying them. Whatever, it's rabbinic chutzpah at its absolute best, right?
Which is why no one reads the story properly. Heaven forbid we witness rabbinic.
Well, whatever, it's hard. It's hard. People, as Lindsay said, sometimes you need the fairy tale, right? but it doesn't mean the rest of us have to be satisfied with it. I want to go, let's look at one more thing. Do you see the yellow text here? You seeing something different than before? No.
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 Okay, let's do one more. Stop sharing one more time. We're going to finish with this. Let's see. This is from Thomas Mann. Okay, this is the last page of the book. So, no spoilers because you guys know it. You know the story, right? So Joseph is confronting his brothers, and we know the story from Chumash that that the brothers are afraid Joseph, once that Jacob is dead, Joseph might, take revenge. But dear brothers, this is Joseph's response to his brothers. But dear brothers, dear old brothers, he replied, bowing to them with arms spread wide. What are you saying? You speak exactly as if you feared me and wanted me to forgive you. Am I as God? I guess that's also Jacob to Rachel, right? Am I as God? In the land below it is said, I am as Pharaoh. And though he is called God, he's but a dear poor thing. That's what I was talking about before, right? Pharaoh, he's just a dear poor thing. But in asking for my forgiveness, you have not, it appears, really understood the whole story we are in. I think that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying to the rabbis. You have not, it appears, really understood the whole story we are in. I do not scold you for that. One can very easily be in a story without understanding it. Isn't this great, right? And I think people who read beyond the fairy tales, only they are able to be in the story in a way that they can understand it. Everybody else is just part of the story unconsciously, right? Joseph says to his right-hand man, you want to be in the story, don't you? Right? You want to be in God's story, right? But in asking for my forgiveness, you have not, it appears, really understood the whole story we are in. I do not scold you for that. One can very easily be in a story without understanding it. Perhaps it was meant to be that way, and I have only myself to blame for always understanding too well the game that was being played. The game that's being played is God's game. This is the Abraham game, right? The Israel game. And he knew it too well. Did you not hear it from our father's lips as he gave me my blessing? That in my case it has always been merely a playful game and an echo. It's a weird thing in mind that it's an echo of something that already happened. I mean, it's not like, in Kabbalah, there's this idea that God looked into, what does he look into? He looks into a book and then he creates the world, right? He looks
the Torah.
Yeah. So that you could see echo is functioning in a similar way. It's an echo of something that existed before that. And then his departing words to you, did he even mention the nasty thing that happened between you and me? Now it's just a nasty thing. Mann also, like Milton, does not hesitate to put in front of our faces that the brothers nearly tear Joseph to shreds. So even though he says it here, that nasty thing, and even his right-hand man says to him, you remember what they did to you, how they nearly tore you limb from limb. Meaning he doesn't not show us the terror and the violence and the suffering. No, he said nothing of it, for he was also part of the game, of God's playful game. Under his protection, I had to rouse you by my brazen immaturity to do evil. But God indeed turned it to good, so that I fed many people and matured a little myself besides. That's one of the greatest lines in the book, right? All these things had to happen, and I fed an entire population, right? A whole people, the greatest people on earth, and also matured a little myself besides. He looks back at himself as being culpable, going back to what Tom said. He's taking responsibility. If it is a question of pardon among us human beings, then I am the one who should beg it of you. For you had to play the evildoers so that everything might turn out this way. Joseph says to his brothers, please forgive me. You got cast in the wrong roles, right? You got cast in the bad roles. I got the good role. You got the bad role. And now I am supposed to make use of Pharaoh's power merely because it is mine, to revenge myself on you for 3 days of chastisement in a well and again turn to evil. What God has turned to good, should I undo God's good and turn it back to evil? Don't make me laugh. Different kind of laugh. For a man who, contrary to all justice and reason, uses power simply because he has it, one can only laugh at him. Who is your favorite autocrat, right? Fill in the blank. Who is your favorite autocrat? Use it for a man who, contrary to all justice and reason, uses power simply because he has it. Unfortunately, there are many leaders in the world today who do that. What does one do? One only laughs at him. If not today.
Is Thomas Mann, is he before or after Shakespeare?
So he's late 20s. He's writing between the two world wars, 20th century.
This to me echoes Measure for Measure.
Okay. Oh, well, we'd have to talk about that, but we're not going to do it right now. But interesting. If not today, then if not today, why? Because today might still suck. Then sometime in the future, and it is the future we shall hold to. We started talking about this, right? Inyan idioma, right? Thinking about the future. If not today, then sometime in the future. And that's for Man. That's what the Jewish people hold out. They hold out the possibility of a future. It's an amazing book, Tikva, because he writes it between 1933 and 1943. The Nazis are coming to power. He's thrown out of Germany in 1939. He goes to live in California, right? So this is like this 10-year testament to the Jewish people. Extraordinary thing. It's a very pro-democracy person.
Jewish?
No, he was not Jewish. If not today, then sometime in the future, and it is the future we shall hold to, sleep in peace. Tomorrow, by God's counsel, we shall begin our journey back to the comical land of Egypt. Comical, I'm not sure of. Yeah, this is what he said to them. And they laughed and wept together. And they all reached their hands out to him as he stood there in their midst, and they touched him, and he caressed them as well. And so ends this invention of God, this beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers. After you read, when you get to 1492 and you read that, you're like, wow, right? It is English professor confession here. This is the longest book I have ever read.
Wow. How long did it take you?
I really savored it. I really, really loved reading it. A couple of months over Shabbos, 3 months, 4 months maybe. Anyway, so here's the question. Is Joseph's laughter here related to Rabbi Akiva's laughter? Or, better, ask the question better. Is there a way in which the laughter here can help us understand Rabbi Akiva's laughter?
Wow.
And I think, the woe that Lindsay said is attached not only to Man, but to the complexity that allows us to kind of glimpse in the Akiva story. Meaning, this is also a midrash of laughter and tears. And I think at the end, these stories, or I'll ask the question: how does Rabbi Akiva's story help his friends understand the present? Meaning, the readings of the story that are unsatisfying are the ones that only emphasize the future. Oh, happy ending, right? Happy ending. But the story itself, it lends itself to that for sure, right? Lends itself to that. But when read with commentary, it doesn't really. It just opens up, really. The prophecies have been exhausted. That's one way of reading it. Or maybe you read of Rabbi Akiva, like I said, that clean reading was reading, that when Zechariah prophesies, it's not only for the second time. It's also for something in the future.
It's like I can understand how it provides a certain hope, but then not so much joy. Like I get how it provides something for the future orientation, but understanding joy is what in the present is to be tasted and experienced.
Is simcha is not here though, right? There's no simcha here.
Well, that's my question. Is I see tikva, right, but I don't see simcha. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Remember, we read that commentary in relationship to the rabbinic reading of Samson that says that Samson, the person who is organizing the joke, he has simcha, right? But Samson doesn't have it, right? He doesn't have that joy because he's not joying in the present moment at all, right? So what is the difference between, I mean, this girsa says sachek instead of tzachek, and I'm still not sure what the difference is.
What is that?
One is the difference between. I asked Tikva this last time. What is the difference between sachek and tzachek?
Well, litzachek means to amuse, but it's got a more vulgar meaning. Mm-hmm. And lisachek means to play or possibly to act, like in a play. Mm-hmm. But I think.
Right, I'm not sure. It's used not all the time, so you have to look carefully. We'd have to look at Makot just to see what it says.
I mean,
but let's go. Yeah.
Litzachek would be like, it's the difference between like the two Elizabethan entertainments. Litzachek is bear baiting, and lisachek would be plays. You know, they're one kind of violent.
Good. Or tzachek, and that explains Samson also. The performance of Samson. Okay, but so here it is sachek. Let's go with that here. You see also with Midrash and anything from Chazal that the Girsaot, which all have some provenance, presumably if they show up, they each require different readings, right? They it's not just, that's why also when you read something like this, which has all the readings mushed into it, you forget to look at each one of them in their individuality. Like when you read the Parsha, there's Rashi's version of Genesis and there's the Ramban's version of Genesis. They are not the same thing. They are different versions of the text, right? So when you have what very often happens these days, you have compendium of Meforshim, they turn the text into something it never was, meaning they turn into a mishmash, right? It's like Shakespeare editions. You take the text that you're likely reading was certainly never written by Shakespeare, because it's an accommodation of so many different texts that an editor says, oh, we've put together an ideal text. Or we just brought them all together. Whatever the reasons to do that in Shakespearean editing. I'm just saying that everything requires quick care, and I emphasize that again, because every way each girsa is a different representation of the story. But let's stick with our representation and our question. What is the nature of his laughter? I mean, in a way, it is a little bit like Joseph's laughter.
Well, what's interesting here is this laughter is interwoven with weeping. So in the Midrash, that would suggest both perspectives together, right? Because we had the one rabbi's weeping and then we had Akiva laughing. But that's my problem with it. It's separated. Whereas here we have the bittersweet interwoven, which is more a real reflection of reality as I understand it. And that's why I have a little bit of a skepticism with Akiva in the Midrash. And that I can't overcome it, you know? There's something in his laughter.
I hear you. But you know what I think for me, the answer to your question, I mean, I've had the same question, I've been thinking about it, is the commentary that I read you before, that the witnesses to which Isaiah refers, according to Rabbi Akiva, are edut echad. They're one edut. They are one thing. I think the commentary is answering your question, that they are one thing, that they are together. And when you face tell me when to stop here if I'm going too far with this, that when you face the world in the present, you face it with the anticipation of laughter or weeping. You're not sure because you're in the middle. You're an Osei Ritzona. Well, we may have not understood it fully, but I guarantee you we understand it much better than most people at this point, right?
The bit
You
with
see the kind
man
of care
kind of-
that you, what's that?
The bit with man kind of threw me into a loop.
I'm sorry to get to you, but I wanted to do that.
Well, because then I start thinking about all the other novelizations of
Okay,
Tanakh.
okay, right. But you see the way Midrashim, just like you can't read a Donne poem quickly, you can't read a Midrash quickly, right? And also, and another thing that I think holds people back from reading properly is they refuse to suspend their disbelief, as Coleridge would say. And the suspension of disbelief is to say, I think as we read Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Yeshua correctly, that they really are feeling desolation. The commentators will come in and say, oh, they didn't really feel desolation. You know, how could they believe that how did they not know that the prophecies would be fulfilled, blah, blah, blah. And they come up with that, they have to do this. But I think if you read it as you would read a poetic text, you're not forced into doing that. They're right. If you don't have to read it like, oh, they were so much greater than us, how could they ever feel desolation? Yeah, they were humans, right? Okay, people, if you're fasting, have a great fast. Thank you so much for sharing this with me. It's great to see you,
Thank
Lindsay.
you.
Great
Thank
to see
you. This was
Rita.
amazing. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, feel good.
I have
Maybe-
been left with tam shel od mamash. Thank you so much.
Be well. See you soon.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.